Hello and welcome to this commemorative program to mark the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. I'm Dan Borsha.
And I'm Kumi Taguchi. On the 15th of August 1945, Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced the end of hostilities.
Unlike the mass celebrations that marked that momentous occasion in 1945, surviving veterans are marking this year's commemoration in COVID-19 confinement, sharing their memories with friends and family in private rather than with their comrades or with public parades.
But it's on these significant anniversaries that we take the time to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice. The Second World War was the bloodiest and most destructive conflict in global history. Cities were destroyed by air raids. The atom bomb was dropped on Japan, and 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust.
More than 60 million soldiers and civilians died. It came just a generation after the war to end all wars had finished. The madness of trench warfare, of mud, gas and death had left the world shell-shocked, but not enough that it stopped a new wave of carnage on an industrial scale.
More than 1 million Australian men and women volunteered to serve in the war. Over the next half hour, you will hear their moving accounts of courage and bravery, from the heroism of Tobruk to the calamity of the fall of Singapore. These are some of their stories.
The war that consumed the world started with a peace treaty, but the Munich Agreement failed to appease Adolf Hitler's expansionist plans. At dawn on Friday, September the 1st, 1939, the Germans launched their land, sea and air offensive on Poland, and the world quickly became aware of the power of Hitler's Third Reich and his ruthless ambition. The Blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, was spearheaded by panzer tanks, and the speed of Germany's conquest was matched by its brutality. 2 days later, Australian Prime Minister Robert G. Menzies addressed the nation at 9:15 p.m. on every national and commercial radio station.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
It was one of those moments where everyone knew exactly where they were when they heard the news.
I was sitting on the floor beside the wireless, and Mum had been to church, and she came in from church, came in bursting through the front door, saying, "Phyllis, turn the news to the ABC." And then I turned it on to the radio and I heard the solemn voice reporting that England was at war. I can remember that as plain as anything.
We were all sitting around a table, the family, my sisters, my mother, and then my mother started to cry, and the boyfriends all sort of said, "Well, this looks as though it's it."
I was babysitting and I had the radio on, and it said, "And Australia is now at war." I thought, wow. I got so excited. I thought it was wonderful. Grabbed the baby and I ran all the way up to our house, burst in through the front door and stopped. And there was Dad and Mum. Dad's standing there, and Mum's got his arms around Mum, and Mum's crying into his shoulder, and he kept saying, "It's all right, Meg, it's okay. The war will be over by Christmas. Pat and Jim won't have to go." And my two brothers, and I thought, Pat and Jim at the war? No. All the excitement, there was nothing, just drained away, and I thought, no, I don't want that. And the war didn't finish, went on, and Pat went away, and then Jim went away, and I became an ambulance driver, and that's how we saw the war out. And it wasn't pretty. I don't ever want to see another one.
It seems strange today that so many Australians would willingly go halfway across the world to defend king and empire, but it was a very different world and a very different Australia, one which had unwavering loyalty to Britain.
There is one task in front of us, and that is that we, the people of Australia, should do as much as the people of Great Britain towards the winning of a war which is our business just as much as it is their business.
Australians had been hardened by the experiences of the economic depression, the ruthless campaigns of the First World War, and the relentless lottery of death in the stalemate of trench warfare.
Join in, brother, left, right, left. Come on and join up, come on and join up, come on, your country is calling.
Within 2 months, 75,000 young men had signed up to fight in campaigns against the Axis forces across Europe, the Mediterranean and North Africa.
So I there walked in the recruiting office at the Malvern Town Hall, 15 years of age. He said, "What's your date of birth?" I said, 15/2, 20. So it made me 20 years of age. So on my official army record, I'm 100 years old next February.
For the first time in Australia, women were recruited and became a vital part of the war effort.
Keen as mustard, both young and not so young. Among the thousands who gathered in Centennial Park, there undoubtedly were many who came to giggle, but they remained to praise, for the girls put on a grand show. In a war that envelops everyone, Australian womanhood is splendidly doing its bit. Nor in the blaze of glory must we overlook the unsung heroines voluntarily toiling over sewing machines, knitting needles, soldiers mending in the camps.
As the nation mobilised for war, 1 in 7 Australians would wear a uniform.
In January 1940, the 6th Australian Division sailed into Egypt, just 25 years after their fathers died on the fatal shores of Gallipoli, a glorious defeat which forged the legend of the Anzacs. This time, the threat came from Mussolini's Italy.
At the outbreak of the Second World War, Australia's military was tiny. We had a very small army, the militia, we had a very small navy, and we had a tiny air force. So when the war broke out, one of the things Australia does contribute to this global effort is men. So we provide soldiers for the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. So these were volunteers, and they volunteered to serve anywhere in the world for the duration of war.
Australian forces joined the Allied campaign against the Italians in Libya, which culminated in the capture of Benghazi in February 1941. The German Africa Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel, came to the aid of the Italians, arriving in the capital of Tripoli in March to push the Allies back to the port of Tobruk. Tobruk was considered vital in the Allied efforts to cut off the Axis powers from Egypt and the Suez Canal. Under the command of Australia's Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead, Australian and other British Commonwealth troops were told to hold Tobruk at all cost and were besieged in the port for 8 long months. Surrounded by German and Italian forces, the garrison valiantly held the port against daily tank attacks, artillery barrages and dive-bombing Stukas. The diggers knew the only way out of Tobruk was if they were killed or wounded.
I shall never forget 10 men losing their life at the one time.
The scary part was the shelling at night. The mortars and a lot flying over and other ones that you just heard whip bang, and you know that was pretty close, and then sometimes you'd hear a thud and one would hit the ground, didn't go off.
Supplies of food and water were scarce, ferried in by the Navy, the so-called Scrap Iron Flotilla, who travelled through the sea route between Alexandria and Tobruk that notoriously became known as Bomb Alley. The men of the Tobruk garrison endured the desert's searing heat, the bitterly cold nights and hellish dust storms. They lived in dugouts, caves and crevices and were plagued by flies, fleas and illness. The grit and defiance of the Australian soldiers shattered the myth of German invincibility and earned them the moniker the Rats of Tobruk.
It was the Gallipoli moment from the Second World War. Endurance, improvisation, mateship, humour, all those key characteristics of what we now assume to be the Australian identity.
Tobruk was eventually taken by the German-Italian armies in June 1942. In October, the Australians played a significant part in the Battle of El Alamein. It was the first clear-cut and irreversible victory inflicted by the Allies upon the Axis forces and signalled the beginning of the end of Hitler's reign of terror.
And you have proved it to my satisfaction, and I'm sure to your satisfaction, and I'm quite certain to the enemy's satisfaction, that you can meet him and beat him whenever you come in contact. And remember that you are now members of a tried army, of an AIF that in spirit and quality is second to nothing that is fighting in this war. Remember that you come from the finest country that there is, and that it'll always be proud of you.
Australian airmen also played a key role in the bombing offensives against German targets. Sadly, more than 1/3 of Australian personnel who served with Bomber Command were killed in action. Loyalty to the Empire left our forces divided across the world, and Australia was ill prepared for a new threat, as many thought the war would be won or lost in Europe. For much of the population, Australia seemed like a nation at peace.
Your men march to fight. They look to those on the home front to do their job, to give substance to a rising song of hope. Hope for a world in travail.
Japan was taking advantage of Hitler's war in Europe to advance its own ambitions in the Far East. In the late 30s, Australia, Great Britain and America declared an economic war on Japan.
The Kasamaru is the last Japanese ship to leave Australia, probably for some time to come. She carries more than 100 Japanese, most of whom made hurried preparations for departure. They take with them their goods and chattels.
The devastating blockade was implemented in response to Japan's occupation of French Vietnam. All of Japan's assets were frozen and vital exports, including oil and rubber, were banned. The last Japanese ship was ordered to leave Sydney Harbour on the 15th of August.
There were instances of the well-known Oriental distrust of a camera, some of them extreme.
These tropical islands, now under Australia's guardianship, thus form lonely outposts of the Royal Australian Air Force, vital links in Australia's defence. Native soldiers, fierce bushmen from Papua's untamed wilds, help guard this right-hand end of the strategic line running from Singapore.
At 7:48 a.m. on December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese retaliated. 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers and bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Less than 24 hours later, the British stronghold of Singapore was also attacked by Japanese planes. 2 days later, we were at war with Japan. It was the first time Australia had declared war on another country as an independent nation.
The dark shadow of Japan's new order spreads, first northward, then west and south, but chiefly south. South towards oil, rubber and rice, tin and gold.
In just 10 weeks, Japan achieved a series of victories, resulting in the occupation of much of Southeast Asia and large parts of the Pacific.
The war to us was in Europe, and we had heard about the Japanese that invaded, China and all the way down, but somehow they didn't worry us, because they told us in Singapore that it was impregnable. It was defended by this mighty naval base and there was no threat.
And when I heard that they'd landed not nearly as far from where I was shaving as I had hoped, there was a great sense of urgency that came, and he said, "You wanted at the mess." And I remember one of the great decisions we had to make at the mess, which I imagined we'd be deciding on some profound tactical issues, was what to do with the beer supplies, with the mess beer supplies. And some 1 or 2 suggestions were made, and then some brilliant tactician moved that we drink it, and that was carried unanimously.
With British guns pointing south, anticipating a sea assault, Japan mounted an audacious offensive, battling through the jungles of Thailand and Malaya to attack Singapore from the north. The Allies completely underestimated their new enemy.
We had been told that the Japanese physically were limited in operating aeroplanes. We had not the slightest idea they had the competence and the equipment that they finally turned up with. The most significant thing was that we were told that they couldn't see.
Didn't wear glasses, bloody terrifying. Fought like maniacs. And the equipment they had was just what you should have had in a war at that time in the jungle.
The campaign lasted just a week, and the capture of Singapore was the largest British surrender in history.
You couldn't believe it. From our lovely life we'd had, this right in the middle, and all this destruction, and the casualties coming in. It seems so. Some of them were young men we'd, met out socially and that, and there you had them in all wounded, and some of them died. It was terrible, really.
We lost an entire division, and more than 100,000 Allied soldiers became prisoners of war, including more than 15,000 Australian soldiers and nurses. 1 in 3 POWs would die. Most became victims of their captors' indifference and brutality.
I was next to the ulcer ward, and the treatment in the ulcer ward was that the orderly would come around in the morning, and his treatment was a sharpened spoon. So with a sharpened spoon, he would scrape away all the bad flesh down to the good flesh, and you'd hear these blokes screaming as this orderly was going on his round. So you can imagine if you're next in line waiting for this fellow with a sharpened spoon to come down, until finally there was no other action but they'd cut the leg off.
One officer amputated 40 limbs.
The fall of Singapore remains one of the greatest military defeats in the history of the British Empire.
The fall of Singapore was a strategic calamity. It was a tidal wave, a tsunami of disaster. And with the fall of Singapore to the Japanese, it essentially left the Pacific and Southeast Asia open to the Japanese. During those first few months of 1942, the Japanese could move at will, both through at sea and by air, and the Australian mainland is vulnerable and under threat.
It was one of the darkest days in our wartime history and brought about a seismic shift in foreign policy for the Australian government. The invasion of the Australian continent appeared imminent as we became the target of Japanese air and sea attacks. Just 4 days after the fall of Singapore, the first attack on Australian soil occurred when Japanese planes bombed Darwin, killing more than 250 people, destroying the port, 9 ships and 20 aircraft.
The bombing of Darwin was a wake-up call for Australia. We realised our northern coast was exposed to Japanese attack. In response, one of Australia's most unusual and effective reconnaissance units was formed. 1,000 kilometres of the Arnhem Land coast was patrolled and defended by 51 Aboriginal volunteers, overlooking land and sea to sound the alarm at signs of enemy aircraft.
They were vital to the north of Australia.
We all come together, we fight for one. We fight for our land. When the Japanese comes, we all shoot them, and we all kill them.
With the fall of Singapore and the Japanese imperial forces storming towards us, the newly appointed Prime Minister John Curtin made the strategic decision to shift allegiance from Britain to the United States in a bid to secure military support in the Pacific theatre of war. Churchill wanted the Australians deployed to Burma. Curtin demanded them home immediately. A diplomatic feud followed, and it triggered a monumental shift in our national identity.
We feel that our fate and that of the United States of America are unbreakably linked. We know that our destinies go forward hand in hand and that we will stand or fall together.
American General Douglas MacArthur, having suffered a humiliating loss of 70,000 troops in the Philippines, was evacuated to Australia, where he took command of the war effort. MacArthur and Curtin, prepared for an invasion on Australian shores, led to believe this was Japan's strategy after the bombing of Darwin was followed by shelling over northern Queensland and Newcastle and a midget submarine attack on Sydney Harbour.
I was on the upper deck of a harbour ferry, with a tremendous explosion, and after that, everything seemed to happen at once. As a newspaper man, I expect excitement, but I certainly didn't expect to be nearly torpedoed in Sydney Harbour.
With the Japanese army inching closer to Australia through the Pacific, the young men of the 39th and 53rd Militia, or Citizens Military Force, were placed on a cruise liner turned troop ship at the Aquitania, headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea. Many in the 53rd Militia Battalion from New South Wales were press-ganged off the streets.
They were objecting, I'm sure. There were women screaming out to their husbands or brothers or something or other. And, we found out afterwards they were taken out of their house at home that day, that morning, and marched to probably a camp and then straight onto the boat.
The young, untrained conscripts were not legally allowed to fight overseas, but would fight in New Guinea because it was, at the time, an Australian-mandated territory. Nicknamed Choco, short for Chocolate Soldiers, they were initially taunted by the volunteer AIF, but after coming face-to-face with Japanese soldiers for the first time along the Kokoda Trail, the boys soon proved their worth in the face of harrowing conditions and treacherous terrain.
Oh my God, that walking. The first half an hour I thought, no, I'll never do this. I was exhausted, but I didn't like to show it to anyone, particularly to the country blokes, because they were going along all right. And after he got to Uberry, I was absolutely stonking.
We all learned to smoke pretty much there, and one of the jokes there were that for some reason or other the department issued us with condoms, packet of condoms. Well, of course, all the condoms were used for was to put your tobacco and matches in to keep, because half the time we were crossing rivers and creeks, and in wet conditions, the only thing you could do to keep the tobacco and matches dry was in a condom.
First attempting to invade and capture Port Moresby by sea, the Japanese Navy was stopped by Australian and American fleets in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese then looked to take New Guinea by an overland route, landing in the northern area of Gona, trekking south to confront the Australians, who were setting up camp and an airfield at Kokoda. Our troops were under-resourced and unprepared for the unrelenting horror of jungle warfare.
The Japanese have developed the camouflage of their troops to a very high degree. Near Kokoda, they've been wearing deep, close-fitting, greenish steel helmets with green veils to cover their faces. And the net result is that they're extremely hard to see. Our guerrillas have had to camouflage their own uniforms, but the ordinary troops are still wearing their light khaki, which stands out in the jungle like a German field grey uniform in the Libyan desert.
Kokoda came to symbolise our struggle. The precipitous track through the rugged and frightening jungle of the Owen Stanley Mountains was the scene for terror and bravery in the face of a fanatical enemy.
In my opinion, the Jap will be harder to defeat than the Hun. The reason is simple. The Jap is a fanatic. He never gives in. He dies where he fights. We'll have to kill Japs in their hundreds of thousands to reconquer the countries they have taken. Rather than be captured, Japs have been known to hold a hand grenade to their head and pull the pin out.
But in the face of horror, death and hardship, our troops persisted in their campaign to defend Australia.
On the day we attacked, we had advanced and there was less than 200 meters between us and a young Australian soldier. Naked on top, wearing only his shorts, holding a grenade, ran towards us and threw the grenade. Even the Japanese army would not have the courage to commit such an act.
The caring local Papuans acted as carriers for our sick and wounded soldiers, lovingly nicknamed the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. They also helped transport stores and equipment over the rough mountainous terrain. Over 2 years of fighting in New Guinea, around 625 Australians were killed along the Kokoda Trail and over 1,600 were wounded. Casualties due to sickness, including malaria, dengue fever and dysentery, exceeded 4,000.
This Japanese officer, and when he broke through the Q&A, we were face to face with each other, and I think he was just as bloody scared as I was, and I was just lucky that I could bloody pull the trigger first. Anyway, that was an experience that I wouldn't like to ever handle again, because that haunted me for years. When I went through this bloke's equipment, and that was part of my job, I found he had photographs of himself and his wife and 3 little kids.
On the 6th of August 1945, the world's first atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and the second dropped 3 days later in Nagasaki. The bombs obliterated the cities and instantly killed more than 100,000 people, tens of thousands more later dying from the effects of nuclear radiation. The war had come to an abrupt end, and the shockwaves of destruction left in the wake of the 2 atomic bombs rippled throughout the world. Japan announced its surrender days later on August the 15th.
Japan has been disarmed. Emperor Hirohito's imperial army is home in defeat.
There was confusion in Japan as the emperor's voice was heard for the first time on the radio. He told the nation the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He never used the words defeat or surrender. Indeed, some imperial forces continued to fight until the 1970s. The demise of the Japanese military would shape the country for generations. Post-war Japan is defined by its downfall. Japan's formal surrender came on the 2nd of September on board the USS Missouri, overseen by General MacArthur, American soldiers and high-ranking representatives from 9 allied nations.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always.
The war was finally over, and our servicemen and women and surviving prisoners of war could finally return home.
Home from the damp and the sweat, from the leeches and mosquitoes, from the fear of the jungle stillness.
There was dancing in the streets after victory in the Pacific. The gruesome, exhausting and costly war was finally over.
Hello everyone, this is Talbot Duck Madden speaking to you from Martin Place, Sydney. It's about an hour since the official news came through. There are thousands and thousands of people. Honestly, I've never seen so many people in Martin Place before.
But it was a bittersweet moment for many Australians whose loved ones would not be coming home.
And everybody was excited and they all took the war's over, the war's finished. And there was a woman staring at the fruit and I went over to her and I said, "Did you hear that?" I said, "The war is over, it's finished." And she just turned around and she said, "My 2 sons were killed in Tobruk. It'll never be over for me."
In war, nobody really wins, in my humble opinion.